Hey kids, so good news. The AP exam will not ask you a DBQ or FRQ, or maybe even a short answer question after the year 1980. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have to know this stuff, because maybe a question might be compare Republicanism of the 1860s to the Republicans during Reagan's era. So there's not going to be an essay that exclusively applies to only 1980 and beyond. But every now and then they sneak one in. In fact, if you ask me, they rarely ask anything past Vietnam, so that's good. However, you will see multiple choice questions on these topics, and this is really good synthesis. We're going to get to the quote unquote end of U.S. history. This is the stuff that you should be making connections to when you're writing your essays. So we're still going to cover it, you're still going to be tested on it, and it is still important. Although, what's ironic about all this is that history gets harder to study. We have access to much more complicated information than we've ever had before. How do we pick what's important and what's not? That's a part of what we call historiography, and that's actually what makes studying in this era difficult. How do you study the stuff from when you're alive? And I'm actually getting to the point where I'm going to be alive in the stuff that I'm teaching, which is odd and scary to me. That being said, let's jump in. Alright, so what are we going to look at in this chapter? Chapter 30 is going to go over 3 presidents, but 2 of them don't matter. We're going to start by discussing the end of President Ford and the entire Carter presidency, and then we're going to dive into President Ronald Reagan, a very revered president, but maybe not for the reasons you're thinking, and that's what we're going to be discussing in this chapter. So let's dive in. So, as you guys looked at in chapter 29, you've already seen some stuff about President Ford. Really, all we have to talk about with him is that he becomes vice president, and then several months later, Nixon's going to resign. So we have this guy that no one really knew. He doesn't even become vice president by an election. He's appointed the vice presidency after Agnew resigns. And so here's this guy that's never been elected, has only had the job for a couple of months, and now he's the president of the United States. And the very first thing he does is pardon Nixon and tells America to forget the entire thing. So the American public is like, who are you? What are your qualifications? And, why should we listen to you? So he doesn't do much while president, mainly because, well, there's not much for him to do. We call him a caretaker president. He pretty much just sits there and waits for the next guy to get elected. Now, who is this next guy? Well, his name is Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is going to be elected to the presidency in 1976 mainly because he is not a politician. The 70s are a time period when we don't trust the presidency, mainly because people are so upset at Nixon, and not just about Watergate, but also about Vietnam. So, really, the American public wants a guy that's kind of a political outsider because we feel like we can trust him. He is a Democrat, which, of course, after Watergate, it's pretty much guaranteed that a Democrat will win the presidency, but has very little political experience. His most relevant act was being a successful peanut farmer. You heard me, he farmed peanuts. Oh, and I guess he was the governor of Georgia, but I'm not sure if that actually counts as an actual qualification. Carter's problem is that he's a super nice guy that sees way into the future with problems that most Americans don't care about. Like, Carter is going to be concerned about things that didn't become a problem until after you were born. So it's the 1970s, and he's talking about problems in 2006. Now, by the way, he accurately predicts the problems that we're going to have. He's just thinking 40 years into the future. And unfortunately for politicians, that is usually a bad sign. If you're thinking too far into the future, Americans are like, well, great, what are you going to do for me now? We're struggling now, and you want us to be concerned about the future? That's not how we think. Carter does. Carter's big thing, well, one of the several big things, is going to be about the environment. Carter wanted Americans to cut energy consumption. We waste energy during this time period, specifically oil, which is a problem because we don't really produce it anymore. We have to go get it from other places. Wouldn't it be really bad if we base our entire economy and production and consumption off of a resource that we can't make here in the United States? Wouldn't that lead us to conflicts into a place that has a lot of oil, like the Middle East? Oh, see what I'm saying? He thinks 40 years into the future. One of the many proposals that Carter had was this thing called the National Energy Act, which was going to place a tax on gasoline and essentially extend tax credits on renewable energy research. The problem was oil consumption does go down, but the economy is going to get worse. OPEC is really upset at us for a various litany of reasons that's not really worth getting into. So they're going to raise oil prices, and it's going to basically destroy the entire U.S. economy. It's a problem when OPEC raises oil prices because we have based our entire economy off of automobiles. Our industry doesn't really make anything anymore. We're service-based, which means that we don't have any actual production here. And essentially, we have an economy based off of foreign competition, which is going to force us, who get paid too much for work, to close businesses. So when the price of oil inflates, everything else inflates around it, and there's nothing in our economy to support itself. The economy is going to come crashing down. Carter has some ideas on how to fix this economy, but no real overall strategy. The American public is going to blame him for not having a good enough idea on how to solve this problem. The thing is, he had a great idea for solving this problem. America just didn't want to go along with it. What was his idea? To stop using oil. Now, foreign policy is also going to be important for President Carter. He doesn't do a lot internationally, mainly because he's focused on national concerns, but there are a couple of big things that we should discuss. There's going to be a big struggle between Israel and Egypt during this time period. It's really gone back ever since Israel was created. So Carter is going to invite the Prime Minister of Israel and of Egypt to come and have a discussion about peace. This discussion is called the Camp David Accords. So they meet at Camp David, everyone talks, everyone's happy, and there's going to finally be some peace between Israel and Egypt. You have probably spent your entire life not even knowing that Israel and Egypt were having a problem, because the problem you always hear about is Israel and Palestine. That's another problem. We're going to solve the Israel-Egypt problem first, and that's what's going to be done at the Camp David Accords. When it comes to Russia, basically the only thing Carter does is renew the SALT program. Of course, SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. We are going to try to limit the number of dangerous weapons, specifically nuclear weapons. Carter's going to make sure that we do that. He's kind of big on peace. It also helps that this is really a time, the Soviet Union is essentially collapsing by this point, so we don't need to stay strong on them so much. Okay. Remember when I was saying that we have an oil problem, and maybe it's a good idea if we are friends with people that control oil? There's one part of the world that controls a lot of oil. It's the Middle East. And the United States is going to get involved in Middle Eastern politics very early on. It leads to something called the Iranian Revolution. So the story goes like this. In 1953, the United States overthrew the Iranian government and installed a leader loyal to the U.S. named Shah Mohammed Reza Pahlavi. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I'm terrible at pronouncing these things. We do this in order to gain access to Iran's oil reserves, because they've got a lot of them. The Shah had been supported by the United States. His regime was harsh, and he was hated by his own people in Iran. Shiite Muslims, who are fundamentalist Muslims, led by a dude named Ayatollah Khomeini, are going to challenge the rule of the Shah and begin a fundamentalist Muslim revolution. And they're going to change how Iran is going to be run. Ayatollah Khomeini is going to call the United States the Great Satan for supporting the Shah and blames us for the horrible regime that the Shah had set up. The Shah is going to flee to the United States for cancer treatment in October of 1979, and when he does that, Ayatollah Khomeini takes over the Iranian government and installs an Islamic fundamentalist state. Khomeini's going to cut off oil supplies to the United States, causing another much more devastating gas shortage in our country. So where does things get even more complicated? Well, on November 4th, 1979, 300 students who are going to be fundamentalist supporters of the revolution are going to take over the American embassy in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran. So there's going to be an American embassy in the capital. A bunch of college students are going to basically surround the capital and surround the embassy, and they're going to keep the Americans there held hostage. Over 66 Americans are going to be held hostage, and they're going to be held there, trapped for 444 days. Wait a minute. Americans are going to be trapped for 444 days, and no one steps in to help them, or to save them, or to get them out? What the heck is wrong with President Jimmy Carter? Send in SEAL Team 6. What are you doing? This is a bunch of college kids holding American CIA agents hostage for 444 days. Carter, what on earth are you doing? If you think that way, you are the average American citizen. Carter's going to get hell for this, for not doing enough. Unfortunately, Carter does try to send the military, or a small military operation in to help, but it fails miserably. Carter's going to be openly mocked by Americans in the Republican Party and by those in the Middle East. It wasn't until the day Carter left office that the new president, Ronald Reagan, is going to have the prisoners freed. In actuality, the prisoners were freed 2 months earlier, but Reagan wanted to make a grand entrance as president. Think about it. Americans have known that these hostages have been held for a long time. Then all of a sudden, Reagan comes in and says, "Hey, it's my first day on the job, and I solved your problems." America. There's a reason why the American public has this weird fascination and adoration of Ronald Reagan. Think of how he starts his presidency. He starts his presidency by solving the biggest problem in America at this time period. Where are these hostages? How are we going to free them? Reagan works a deal out in the background, and the day he becomes president, he brings those hostages home. This guy is revered as solving the problem that no one else could solve for an entire year. In fact, let's talk about this dude. That's so Reagan. I like Reagan. He kind of reminds me of my grandfather. And in fact, he kind of reminds everyone in America of their grandfathers, which is what makes him, so easy to respect. Now, granted, he's like super old when he becomes the president. He is a former actor, so he's got that going for him. He's charming. He's well-spoken, even though he is suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's. So when you watch his speeches, you'll see he makes some weird blunders. He starts saying things out of old movie scripts, mainly because his mind was slowly deteriorating, which is unfortunate. Reagan's going to have a lot of good and a lot of bad things that happened during his presidency. Let's kind of go pick and choose through some of them. I can't cover everything. Let's pick and choose through some of them and see what he does while president. We're going to go through what we call a conservative resurgence during the 1980s. Essentially, Carter was such a failure in the American public's eyes that the American public is like, okay, we got to go away from that philosophy. Obviously, the Democrats are weak on communism, they are weak on the Middle East, and they are weak on social problems. They're weak on the economy. We can't deal with them. Nuts to the Democrats. Let's go conservative. And well, what are the conservatives going to say? One of the first problems that conservatives say, what is hurting our economy, is that 1 out of every 3 Americans were receiving some form of aid for government programs. So, some sort of aid. They were taking some sort of money from the U.S. government. We call these entitlement programs. So, entitlement programs are basically money given to people that many, especially conservatives, are going to say is unjustified. Their biggest target is going to be this idea called affirmative action. Now, affirmative action is this idea that employers should give special consideration to women and minorities when it comes to hiring for jobs or admissions for college, mainly because these groups have been held back in America for the last 150, 200 years. So why don't we make it our policy to specifically hire women and minorities for jobs, or to give them a certain set number of um, applications into colleges and stuff. That way we can help reverse this wide, long-raging inequality that we've had. The problem is, many conservatives are going to say, wait a minute, this is just reverse racism against, reverse discrimination, I should say, against whites. Why is it that you're going to set aside, out of 200 available positions, why are you going to set aside 75 for women and minorities that might not be qualified? Shouldn't the job go to the person who's the most qualified? That makes sense. But unfortunately, the people that are the most qualified are the ones that have already been the most qualified. So there's this weird balance you have to find between getting qualified people and also helping others become qualified, if that makes sense. It's going to be a big struggle, and it's going to be one that conservatives are really going to fight against. They don't like affirmative action. This is also going to be a time period of a large religious revival in this country. 50% of Americans went to church regularly in the 1980s. That number is a lot lower now. This is going to be a reaction to the weird counterculture we had in the 60s and 70s, especially the drug and rock and roll culture. The reaction to that is going to be, whoa, maybe we got to go back. We went a little too far, got a little too crazy there. Now we need to go back and be a little bit more religious. Again, America swings back and forth. Perhaps you've noticed that. Religious leaders are going to call themselves part of a moral majority and began to influence public policy and push for traditional family values. With all this in mind, the Republican Party is going to pick this new upstart candidate to become their representative for the presidency. The dude's name is Ronald Reagan. He actually used to be a Democrat, but what he says is that I did not leave the Democratic Party. It left me, and that's why I became a Republican. He promised to promote conservative values, have a tough stance on communism, lower taxes, and make the government smaller. He had one of my favorite political campaigns of all time. This is what he said. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Well, if you're not better off now than you were 4 years ago, maybe it's time for a change. He's going to be, I use the word endearing when it comes to Reagan. He's going to endear himself to the American public. And I'm not going to say the American public is going to worship him, but there is a certain reverence that he has that we haven't given a president in a while. So let's see what happens during his presidency and figure out why that is. In fact, maybe this image shows why we like Reagan so much. This is pretty much, if you can summarize this picture, you pretty much have summarized Reagan's presidency. Riding a velociraptor, using an American flag saddle, having a, I'm not sure what kind of gun that is, Uzi, and a rocket launcher on his back. Notice the cowboy hat in the background? Oh yeah, that is Reagan. Moving on. Let's start with the most controversial thing that happens during his presidency, and we'll see if you guys can understand what's going on here. Again, whenever I talk about the economy, people start to go, and they freak out. The economy is actually not that hard to understand. It's just you have to step away from U.S. history for a while to see how it all works. Now, we've got to remember, Reagan is a conservative. Conservatives are always anti-taxes. And they're usually, and by usually I mean always, going to support people that already have money. Republicans and conservatives are going to be supporters of the wealthy and business owners. That's just how they are. So, with that in mind, Reagan's plan is going to be very important and is going to help those who already have money. Here's what it's called. It's based on an idea called supply-side economics. The argument is, if people have more money, they'd spend more money. And when they spend money, it would mean that when they spent more money, it would mean that they're going to buy yachts, they're going to buy houses, they're going to buy, countries. And average Americans like you and me are going to be making those things. So we're going to make the products that that the rich are going to buy frivolously. Then that will give us jobs making those products. So rather than having the rich be taxed and having the government provide services and jobs, instead, let's encourage the rich to buy things. That way, that will promote the economy. That sounds like a great idea. And it is. It is a great idea in theory, but there's one small problem. The big problem with supply side economics is what happens if the wealthy don't spend every dollar they have? What happens if they do something disastrous and save that money and not actually spend it? I mean, think about it. There are only so many yachts you can buy. What happens when you've bought everything that you need? Well, you're just sitting on a mountain of money, and that's not going anywhere else. That's not helping the rest of the economy. That's what taxes are for. So, essentially, what's the problem with trickle-down, supply-side economics, or Reaganomics is that the idea is sound. The idea is not taxing the wealthy and encouraging the wealthy to spend or to make more businesses or whatever. Unfortunately, in theory, what happens with this is that the wealthy spend a little bit of money and then stop. So that money does not flow down to the rest of the economy, down to you and me. However, when Reaganomics is going to be applied, at first it seemed like it worked. Inflation's going to basically slow down, which is good. Consumers are going to spend more money, and initially jobs are going to be created. Unfortunately, this is going to be a very slow process. And there's going to be a lot less revenue coming into the federal government, which means the government's going to start cutting a bunch of programs. So while the wealthy are keeping their money, unfortunately, the poor are going to be even further put behind, mainly because the government's going to start cutting all of those expensive services that were designed to help them. One of Reagan's legacies is that he's really, really good for the wealthy, but he's really, really bad for those that are suffering. So that's one of the trade-offs we have with Reagan. The hardest people that are going to be hit by this budget deficit are going to be the poor, farmers, and immigrants. Not to mention minorities and women are going to be kind of held back by this economic theory. Let's talk about the other controversial thing that happened during Reagan's presidency. Reagan's going to take a very aggressive foreign policy stance with the Soviet Union. During his campaign speeches, he demonizes the Soviet Union and calls them the evil empire. Part of me thinks this is actually kind of a tie back into Star Wars. Now, the Iran-Contra affair is super complicated. I'm going to try to boil it down to its smallest parts. Here's the deal. If this confuses you, if you get a little lost, and if you're kind of, like, how is this all happening? Don't worry. You're probably never going to have to know the specifics. I doubt they'd even ask you a question on this because it's kind of controversial. So I'll just tell you what happened. Hopefully we'll learn something from it. If not, it's not the end of the world. Okay? Here's how it went down. Essentially, we're going to have some problems in South America. Nicaragua is going to be involved in a civil war. In the 1970s, the U.S. is going to support some rebels known as the Sandinistas. Reagan was convinced that Nicaragua was a communist outpost ruled by the new Sandinistas. So when he becomes president, he goes, you know what? Nuts to the Sandinistas. I'm actually going to support the Contras. Essentially, the Contras are a militant group based out of neighboring Honduras. They are going to engage in sabotage and raids in Nicaragua. Reagan's going to send in the CIA without Congress's approval to help the Contras. In fact, Congress, fearing another Vietnam conflict, specifically forbade Reagan from providing any help to the Contras. So, Reagan's got to figure out a way to help the Contras but not violate that little pesky constitution. What does he do? Well, Reagan's going to sell weapons to Iran and take that money from the sale of weapons to Iran and give it to the Contras. That way the Contras can fund a civil war in Nicaragua. Does that all make perfect sense? No? Okay, great. Essentially, the U.S. government's going to find out. And they're going to say, Reagan, dude, what the hell? What are you doing? Are you insane? Well, I mean, he might have actually been. He did have Alzheimer's, which is unfortunate. But they say, Reagan, what's going on? Like, what is this? So things get a little interesting here. And someone else, his name is Oliver North, is going to stand up and take the blame and say, this was all my idea. Reagan knew nothing about it, which is complete BS. But still, that's essentially what happens here. Reagan is never proven to be directly tied to this scandal, but the legacy of Reagan in Iran and Reagan in Latin America is going to still stand. People began to question Reagan's actions and policies. However, Reagan is going to quickly refocus America on the true enemy, the Soviet Union. Let me tell you what I mean. I think this is a perfect time to introduce this picture, especially after discussing the Iran-Contra affair. Of course this isn't complicated to me. I've spent 15, 20 years studying this. But to you guys, this might be a little complicated, and that's okay. It's supposed to be. Hey, look at this election map. Holy cow. Reagan runs away with it, which is funny because he's kind of an old man, so it's kind of like hobbling away with it. But check it out. 1984. He had 97% of the electoral vote and almost 60% of the popular vote. In history, we always say when this happens that the president has a popular mandate. So what does he have a popular mandate to do? Reagan promises America that he will single-handedly crush the Soviet Union. He's going to bring the Soviet Union down. That is his goal. He promises America that, and now we got to figure out, how does he do it? This story, the story of how the Soviet Union falls, is why Reagan is so highly revered. Let's see what he does. At the very start of Reagan's second term, he realizes something. The Soviet Union is on the verge of collapse, but there's one thing that we have to do to bring them down. The way to end the Cold War is to outspend the Soviet Union. His plan is to increase military spending and to build bigger and bigger weapons, to dump more money into NASA, to do more big, huge, showy, flashy things, and force the Soviet Union to keep doing that. Eventually, the Soviet Union would crumble because they don't have the economy to support that kind of spending. Essentially, Reagan's going to use this idea of deficit spending and billing our grandchildren for things we need right now to destroy the Soviet Union. How does Reagan destroy the Soviet Union? He just bills you for it. It worked. Let's see how he did it. The first thing he does is he establishes something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the idea was, we're afraid that the Soviets can shoot a nuke from Russia, have it fly over the Atlantic Ocean, and smack into the United States. We know because of ICBMs that this process is possible. So, Reagan said, what if we launched a bunch of satellites into space, put lasers on them, and then if the Soviets launched a weapon into the air, the lasers would intercept it in space and blow it up. Kind of sounds like Star Wars, right? Yeah, I know, because that's what he called it. He called it Star Wars. Now, this never actually happens. This is completely bogus. It's not even practical even today. But the Soviets thought it might be, so they're going to have to build their defense and weapon systems up on the off chance that we're telling the truth. See what I'm talking about? The Soviets can't keep up that kind of spending. It's going to destroy them. So, Reagan's buildup of the military is going to force the Soviets to keep up with us. They can't, they collapse. How much money are we talking about here? Well, to put it simply, Reagan is going to double the defense budget to over $300 billion. What does that mean? Throughout the 1980s, the United States is going to spend $34 million an hour on defense. $34 million an hour on defense. That's expensive. Now, it helps that Russia's going through some of its own problems during this time period. At the time, a new leader is going to come to power in the Soviet Union. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. I like saying that name, Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan is going to meet with Gorbachev several times to discuss military arms limitations, which is a total joke because we're not going to limit our amount of weapons. We're going to keep building them. The problem is Gorbachev is really concerned about the United States, but really his bigger issue is the communist regime is crumbling. The people are starting to revolt in Russia. He's going to be slightly more focused on solving that problem than he is to be concerned with us. So Reagan's going to push, and Gorbachev is going to be pushed, if that makes sense. Reagan's going to push up against Gorbachev, and Gorbachev's going to have to back down. One of the many things that Reagan's going to push Gorbachev on is this wall. You can see it here in the bottom left. In 1961, the Soviet Union built a wall in Berlin to block off East and West Berlin. East Berlin's going to be Communist Berlin. West Berlin's going to be American Berlin. He builds this wall to keep the areas separate. Reagan is going to travel to Berlin and famously stand in front of the wall and demand that Gorbachev tear it down. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev." We'll watch the video in class. But that's what this is about. Gorbachev does tear down that wall, and he's kind of showing that he is a little bit weak when it comes to trying to stand up to the United States. Well, what's going on in Russia? Gorbachev has two ideas that really signal the end of a communist dictatorship. Remember, in this ideal of communism, you gotta be mean. You have to intimidate the people to make them go along with it. You have to be a dictator. You gotta be a Stalin. You gotta be a Mao. What does Stalin and Mao have in common? They don't listen to dissent. Gorbachev's big mistake is that he's going to allow people to basically say what's wrong in the government. The first one's called glasnost, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly. Gorbachev is going to allow open criticism of the Soviet government. His goal was to learn what to fix and how to fix from the people who are suffering. It kind of makes sense. When you become a manager of a business and something's wrong, listen to your employees. They deal with it every day. They would know. The other idea that Gorbachev's going to do is called perestroika, which essentially means economic restructuring. He's going to allow for private business to promote competition and to help fix the economy. Unfortunately, Gorbachev's ideas had the exact opposite effect. Rather than fixing the Soviet economy, it's going to make things much, much worse. And by allowing people to express dissent, you're going to basically crumble your own power of the regime. Over the next 5 years, member states of the Soviet Union are going to start demanding their independence. To make matters even worse, Gorbachev's going to allow elections in a country. Oh, Gorby, you can't do that. If you're trying to maintain a communist dictatorship, you can't allow elections. That's the most guaranteed way to make sure they go away. Slowly but surely, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is going to start losing countries. Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, the Ukraine, all these countries start to demand their independence from Russia, and Gorbachev's going to give it to them. The Soviet Union is starting to crumble. I like that quote. It's a good one. Go ahead and read it to yourself. I'll pause. Now, I'm going to go a little bit as an aside here and just tell the story of the next leader because I think he's funny. Gorbachev's going to basically leave Moscow to go on a vacation. And when he does, other communist leaders come in and basically take over and try to restore communism. They're going to fail miserably. And as a result of this weird leadership crisis, the Soviet Union officially collapses. In December of 1991, the 15 republics had all officially declared independence, and the USSR goes back to being called Russia. On December 25th, 1991, Boris Yeltsin, pictured here, dancing, is going to become the new leader. And essentially, Russia is going to go from communism to like a dictatorship. You know, apparently the story always goes, Russia likes their dictators. They don't know how to handle things when there isn't a dictator. Really, it's like a democratic dictatorship, if that makes sense. Yeltsin is going to spend the next couple of years trying to fix Russia, and really, the United States doesn't have to worry about them anymore. the Cold War kind of just fizzles out. Now, Americans spend, especially if Americans that were born in the 50s and 60s, spend their entire lives afraid of a nuclear war, which is possible to happen. But you'd expect that there'd be some big, huge, climatic, crazy fight between the US and the Soviet Union, and that would end communism. That's not what happens. We basically build up our weapons and pretend that we're going to go all crazy. We don't. And then the Soviet Union is going to collapse just trying to keep up with us. That's it. That's the story. No big, giant conflict. I know. I know. Well, let's move on. So, wait, Mullen, was Reagan a good president or a bad president? Like, you kind of said some negative things about Reaganomics. You said some negative things about the Iran-Contra affair. But at the same time, you said some positive things about ending the freaking Cold War. We spent 45 years fighting this. So was he good or bad? Well, I'm going to make a statement I've made to you guys several times. He's both. There's good and bad things about everyone. There's good and bad things about you. There's good and bad things about me. There's good and bad things about everyone. And if you just look at one or the other, you could argue Reagan was a terrible president. You could also argue that Reagan was the greatest president in American history. It's short-sighted and incorrect of us as historians to just look at one thing that a president does. At the time, Reaganomics was a very good solution to America's problem. Unfortunately, it didn't pan out in the long run. At the time, it was super expensive to build up this huge, crazy military and increase all this defense spending. But it ended the Cold War, and it kept America as the dominant country in the world. See what I'm saying? It's tough. Reagan's going to be able to restore stability and power, and more importantly, respect to the office of the presidency. He's going to install the first female to sit on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. He's going to make sure the court is much more conservative. Inflation's going to ease during his presidency, yet the deficit is going to grow dramatically. There's very little help to the poor or the disadvantaged, but his presidency is going to be very big on restoring America to its greatness, even if there's going to be some victims in that restoration. I want to end the story of Reagan with a story. Now, some people disagree about this story. I'm not sure if it's entirely true, but it's poignant and it's kind of a sweet way to end our discussion of him. So, Reagan is, after he leaves the presidency, he is dying of Alzheimer's. He has it for about 10 years. It takes him a good 10 years after the presidency to die. Story goes a couple months before he died, he gets a gift in the mail. He opens up the gift and it is a snow globe. The snow globe is of the White House. And Reagan sits there and he's holding this snow globe and he starts crying. And his wife, Nancy, comes up to him and says, "Ronald, what's wrong?" And Reagan says, "I know this is important to me. I just don't know why." Sad. Okay, let's talk about some other stuff. Again, your textbook always throws in some additional details at the end of a chapter. Let's talk about those additional details. First, yuppies. So the 1980s were typified by a new group of young urban professionals known as yuppies. These yuppies are going to be very self-absorbed with the prevalence of health-conscious people. A new concern about health and exercise and diet strikes in the 1980s, leading to a war on fast food and a war on drugs. Yuppies are going to be very self-righteous and entitled, and they're going to spend money frivolously, which is going to lead to several recessions and debt crises over the next 30 years. I don't know how to say this, but your parents might be from this yuppie generation. Especially if they're a little bit older, they might be from this yuppie generation. In fact, ask your parents if they own that kind of a phone or had a suit like that. They might have actually been yuppies. Oh no. Let's talk about women. The birth rate is going to fall dramatically in the 1980s, mainly due to a rise in the number of abortions. Remember, abortions have been legalized by Roe v. Wade. In fact, in the United States, about 1.5 million abortions a year take place during most of the 1980s. Due to families having fewer or no children, women begin to enter the workforce and they stay there. The number of women in the workforce is going to go up over 40 million by 1990. However, women's wages are still going to lag behind those of males, and women are still going to be relegated to tasks that men don't want. However, women do begin to enter medical and legal fields and start pushing for more equality in these fields in the 1990s. By 1990, women make up 20% of all doctors and lawyers in the country. Also, during the 1980s, the sexual taboos of the 50s and 60s are going to disappear. However, with the increase in sex in the 1980s comes the increase in sexually transmitted diseases. AIDS, which of course stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, was first diagnosed in 1981. AIDS spread mostly through homosexual and bisexual communities during this time period. However, it was a killer disease that had no real cure. 31,000 people in the United States died of AIDS in the 1980s, and the numbers only got far worse in the 1990s. Black Americans are going to go through a fierce dichotomy during the 1980s. Some Black Americans are going to receive large upward mobility, which means that they're going to actually break out of the poverty cycle. They enter the workforce and they receive higher paying jobs. Enrollment for colleges is also going to double for Black Americans during the 1980s. However, city slums are going to get significantly worse during this time period as well. And the high school dropout rate in urban communities is going to rise to nearly 60%. 32% of Black Americans in the United States are going to be impoverished, which is the highest of any minority. Drugs and violence are also going to remain prevalent. A Black male is 6 times more likely to be murdered than a white male who lives in the same geographic area. Added to this, nearly 60% of all Black births in the 1980s were by unmarried women. This is going to add to the poverty cycle and welfare problems many Black Americans are going to face and continue to this day. Part of the necessity for affirmative action programs came from a desire to prevent a permanent underclass of Black Americans. The point of affirmative action was to destroy this poverty cycle. Unfortunately, it's still going to be continuing. Finally, for this chapter, let's talk about the status of immigrants. 75% of American immigrants are going to come from Asia and Latin America in the 1980s. Due to a decrease in the production and price of oil in Mexico, a large number of Mexican immigrants are going to come to the United States. Many of these immigrants do not enter the United States legally and are not properly documented and begin working jobs that many Americans don't want, mainly in farming and other service industries. Unfortunately, because these are undocumented immigrants and they're not citizens, they're not going to be paid the same as an American citizen, and we're going to keep having a horrible poverty cycle for these immigrants as well. The question became, what should Americans do with all these immigrants? In 1986, Reagan's going to pass the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which is going to outlaw the hiring of illegal immigrants, but it did offer legal status to immigrants who had been in the United States for 5 years. We call this amnesty. So the idea was, we're going to make immigration, we're going to basically start to enforce illegal immigration more, but for the immigrants that are already here, we're not going to punish you. But if anyone else comes, there's going to be punishments. This does not sit too well with the conservative community, and it's going to be something else that Reagan's kind of not going to be well liked for, but it does kind of help the immigration process for a little bit. And that's the end of chapter 30. Oh my goodness, we only have 2 more. Okay, so before we start chapter 31, I want to remind you guys that, to be honest, this is this time period where I have a lot of videos, so I'm going to kind of cover stuff in this video kind of briefly, because in class we'll look at some videos that go into more details. I can tell some of the boys are already excited. We're going to show videos of the impeachment. Shut up. We're going to be looking at some videos about some of the events specifically. So, again, I'm going to cover the highlights of this time period of the 1990s. We'll get through some stuff. We'll kind of gloss over some other stuff. That's just kind of how this is going to work. So, let's go. Let's keep it going. We're almost done. 2 chapters left. Okay. Reagan is in no condition, nor is he constitutionally allowed to run for office again. So it's time for his vice president to step up. Now, George Herbert Walker Bush is the vice president under Reagan, and this man is actually one of the most, how do I say this? One of the most storied Americans. I mean, think about it. The guy was a fighter pilot in World War II. He is going to be involved in the CIA and the FBI. He's the vice president of the United States. This dude had an amazing life, and he's a great American, did a lot of service for this country. As president, we'll get there. But he is a very popular and very capable candidate. So what happens? Well, look at this election. This is pretty much a sweep for Herbert Walker Bush. You see a guy there, the Democrat, Dukakis. There's really not much interesting to say about him except for his name. So I'll just move on. The first big problem that Herbert Walker Bush is going to face is the Persian Gulf War. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraq is going to invade its neighboring country of Kuwait. Now, remember, the Middle East is floating on an ocean of oil, but unfortunately, the oil doesn't just happen to sit right on the country borders. Iraq wants Kuwait's oil, so Iraq is going to invade Kuwait. The Iraqi dictator at the time, this dude named Saddam Hussein, does not like Kuwait being friendly to the United States and giving oil to us, so he's going to invade this city. The people of Kuwait are going to ask the rest of the world for help. Bush is going to ask Congress for approval to go to war, and he gets his approval. On January 12, 1991, Congress approves the declaration of war. The objective, remove Iraq from Kuwait. The U.S. is going to come steamrolling in with 500,000 troops, which is 3 times more than the rest of the world combined. The war began on January 16th, and the whole thing is over in 6 weeks. Yeah, this was a kick-ass war. On February 23rd, the United States captured Kuwait, and Bush declared a ceasefire. The war cost the U.S. 148 lives, but Iraq lost 45,000. We keep Saddam in power because he promises to leave Kuwait alone, and Saddam is going to be under severe scrutiny from the United Nations. Pretty darn successful war. You'll notice this picture here in the upper right. One of the things that Saddam did as we were invading is he lit the oil fields on fire, the oil wells on fire, and this would blacken the night sky. That way jets could not fly through it and see. It was a very successful tactic on Iraq's part, but it also cost untold billions of dollars in oil losses. Herbert Walker Bush is a really good foreign policy president, but he is not a good domestic policy president. Herbert Walker Bush is really good overseas, not so good at home. And this is no more clearly shown than in the Rodney King trial. So essentially, 4 white officers are going to beat Rodney King. Rodney King is a black man. He's going to be pulled over and beaten. I will show you the video in class, but it is pretty horrific. A trial is going to break out over these officers. When the trial comes out, and essentially what ends up happening here at the end of the trial is that the police officers aren't necessarily acquitted, but they're nowhere near punished enough. Because of it, a 3-day riot is going to break out after the ruling, leading to 40 deaths and $500 million in damages in Los Angeles. The riots were the result of an underlying racial tension that had built up in poverty-ridden cities like Los Angeles due to a lack of funding during Reagan's presidency. So we're going to have a region that is going through a severe poverty cycle, doesn't have the resources it used to have because they're going to be cut due to budgets. There's going to be a racially insensitive, is the best way to put it, event, and the black community is going to respond by protesting and rioting throughout Los Angeles. I remember this happening when I was a little kid, and actually I lived in Orange County at the time, being very afraid of these riots coming down to where I lived. It was pretty scary. However, one of President Bush's successes is going to be the Americans with Disabilities Act. Many disabled people in the United States had a hard time getting jobs, and the ADA was designed in order to make sure that they were not that disabled people were not being unjustly disqualified from jobs because of their disabilities. H.W. Bush is going to run for re-election in 1992, but even though he had really, really high approval ratings because of the Persian Gulf War, there's going to be a little bit of a recession. The economy is going to kind of contract a bit because of the war, and it happens right before the election. So Bush is a really positive foreign policy president, really weak domestically. Excuse me, the Americans are going to be thinking domestic at this time period. H.W. Bush is not going to be the choice. It doesn't help that a new candidate is going to enter the fray here and with a new political party. Remember how I told you every time a political party splits, they lose? The Republican Party is going to split in two. Why? Well, this Texas billionaire named Ross Perot is going to say, you know what, I have a better idea on how to fix the economy. He creates his own political party. He calls it the Reform Party. Perot wants to drastically cut government spending and fix corruption and inefficiency in the government. He said it was simple to fix the nation's problems, but party politics got in the way of reform. He would use all these charts and graphs to prove to Americans that he was right. I remember being a little kid, and I told my mom to vote for Ross Perot because I liked his charts. I was like 9. Mom, vote for Ross Perot. He has really good charts. He also had a very thick southern accent and sounded just like my grandpa. So maybe that was why. So the Republican Party is going to be split over these two different conservative candidates. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party is going to select this young, upstart, don't know much about him, successful governor, though, from the state of Arkansas. His name is William Jefferson Clinton. You probably know him as Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton promises to focus on the environment, health care, and education. He also promises to raise taxes on the rich to help fund programs for the poor. Because of the split in the Republican Party, the Democrats are going to win, even though Clinton only gets about 43% of the popular vote. Perot is going to get nearly 20% of the popular vote, which is the most out of any third-party candidate ever. He might have won, too. Would have really changed America had he have won. Can you imagine if a non-Democrat or Republican was in political office? That hasn't happened since the Republican Party was created in 1860. Something to think about. The Democrats are going to gain control of both houses of Congress as well. The 12-year reign of the Republican Party is over, and now there's going to be some significant changes in America brought about by Clinton and this new liberal leadership. Now, to be fair, Bill Clinton is not a very good foreign policy president, but he's a very good domestic policy president. He handles stuff very well at home. Clinton is going to lead something called the New Democratic Coalition. This is essentially a group made up of political moderates who did not like ultra-liberal attitudes of most Democrats. So Clinton's going to kind of steer the Democratic Party more towards the political center. He's not going to be super radical and controversial politically. Now, of course, if you listen to talk radio at this time period, you'd think that he was a leftist socialist, but that's really not so much the case. He's really going to be more towards the center, which leads a lot of Americans to kind of like the policies he comes up with, because there are policies that most Americans can't agree with. However, let's look at an example of how he would argue a policy. Again, he's going to kind of take the middle road. So let's talk about abortion, a really controversial political opinion. Usually Democrats support it and Republicans don't like abortion. So when someone asked him his stance on abortion, here's what he said. Abortion should be safe, legal, but rare. You see how that's a middle-of-the-road policy? He's very much like Eisenhower in that regard. Clinton is also going to take on bigotry in the military. Clinton is going to argue that homosexuals should be able to serve in the armed services. The conservative community is going to balk at this idea, so Clinton comes up with this idea called don't ask, don't tell. An officer can't ask you your sexual orientation, and soldiers should not really be outwardly acting gay. This is seen as a really big slap in the face to the homosexual community above anything else, and it's going to be a big problem with the homosexual community, and it's not going to be resolved until Obama gets rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. To fight the recession, Clinton is going to cut the military spending because he's going to be president during a time of relative world peace, and is going to increase taxes on the wealthy. One of his biggest political achievements is going to be the North American Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA. The idea is, let's open up trade between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Let's get rid of all of the tariffs between us, and let's all work together. Many thought that NAFTA would send American jobs to Mexico, but in reality that never actually really happened. In fact, NAFTA was just part of a larger economic movement during this time period called globalization. Globalization means how countries and economies are closely related to each other. For example, the United States economy is now dependent on the economy of Japan doing well. If Japan's economy does well, our economy will do well because we're all going to trade with each other. NAFTA just kind of signals that really we should be getting rid of tariffs and we should be working equally with countries all over the world. The economy during this time period was booming. The 1950s are probably the best time to be an American, but the 1990s are a very close second. There's going to be these new technological innovations that come from all this Cold War spending in the 80s. Essentially, the government creates things like personal computers, cell phones, GPS, and the internet, and releases all that stuff to the average American citizen in the 90s. And once something fancy like the internet's going to be created, everyone's going to want to jump on board. Can you imagine what your life would be like if cell phones were invented your freshman year? Wouldn't you all want to have these awesome new powerful toys? Of course you would. That's what the 90s were like. Students find this weird, but I remember a time before I was like one of the few people I knew when I was in junior high to have an email address. In fact, teachers didn't even have computers in a lot of classrooms when I was in junior high. I'm not that much older than you, I think, depending on when you're watching this. So there's going to be this huge change. People are going to want personal computers. People are going to want to start buying things online. And the gross domestic product is going to increase mainly because Americans are going to be spending money like crazy buying all this new, cool, crazy gadgets and stuff that's out there. The American economy does well because Americans are spending money. If America spends money, our economy is going great. Let that serve as a lesson to all of you when you become the dictator of America. Encourage Americans to spend money. It'll lead to more money being spent, which means more jobs, which means more pay. Everybody's happy. Of course, we call this the dot-com boom, which means the internet boom. The economy does do very well, but it's going to, well, explode at some point, but we'll talk about that later. There's so much excuse me. There's so much money coming into the federal government that we can't even spend it fast enough. We have a surplus. We have money left over. So, Clinton puts that extra money into the deficit. He actually pays off a little bit of America's debt. He's the first president to do that since Andrew Jackson. But really, anyone could have been president during this economy and done well. There's just so much money. Any idiot could have been president. Heck, I could have been president and done well because people were spending so much money. It was a good time to be alive. In fact, it's probably the reason why most of you were born. One of the many big issues in America during this time period is going to be welfare reform. As you can see, welfare is a really big expense by the U.S. government. Welfare, of course, is money given to disadvantaged or poor families. That way they have enough food and a place to live, essentially. It's a very expensive program, and the government's going to try to find ways to basically get rid of it. Not get rid of it, but to limit the amount of people that are on it. The Aid to Families with Dependent Children program offered money and assistance to single mothers and struggling families around the country. The problem was it didn't really establish a time limit, so once someone got on welfare, they'd never actually leave. There's going to be a rise during this time period of babies born out of wedlock, which means that some women would continually get pregnant. That way they would get money to raise children and not have to work. Over 14 million women and children were being funded through this program, and it cost over $125 billion a year. We had to find a way to reform this system. The reform is going to be this idea called the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. This is going to end the AFDC and instead gave federal money to states to do their own welfare plans based on states' needs. This is going to end up basically making the entire process less expensive by having states control what happens to the money. Excuse me, which is a very conservative idea. Let's talk briefly about Clinton's foreign policy. So, the story of the world post-Soviet Union breakup is going to be a power vacuum. No one's really in charge in these regions, and there's going to be a lot of mini civil wars that break out in some of these smaller countries who are going to be fighting for their autonomy. One big place where there's going to be a problem is going to be in the Balkan Peninsula. Post-Soviet breakup, this country called Yugoslavia is formed. It's made up of present-day Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia. Each country is their own ethnic group, and they don't like the other ones around them. So when Yugoslavia is made as like this giant country that encompasses all these other smaller ones, they're not going to be happy. Yugoslavia isn't going to last very long, and it's going to be broken up. There's going to be a mass ethnic cleansing by the Serbians who are going to be killing Muslims in Bosnia. Clinton brought the leaders to the U.S. to discuss a ceasefire, but Serbia breaks the agreement. Clinton responded by bombing Serbia. Hey, you don't follow the rules, you get bombed. Eventually, Serbia, the whole conflict's going to die down, but this is going to be seen as a success for the United States. If we make an agreement with other countries, if they don't follow it, they get bombed. It works out pretty well. It's not rocket science, just brain surgery. It also involves some rockets. Let's talk about nuclear proliferation. Nuclear proliferation, I'm sorry, I have a horrible cough as I'm making this. Nuclear proliferation means the expansion of countries that have nuclear weapons. It wasn't so bad when it was just the US and Russia having these weapons, but now more and more countries around the world are developing these weapons. Clinton's going to call for a strategic arms reduction treaty called START II. It's the exact same thing as SALT. Unfortunately, many nations around the world promise that they're never going to have nuclear weapons, but by the time the Soviet Union breaks up, many of them start to get them, specifically India and Pakistan. Now, if you didn't know about this before, India and Pakistan hate each other, and they're in a constant fight over this region called Kashmir. You know it from the Led Zeppelin song. Anyway, both sides have this weapon that could, obliterate humanity, and we're trying to make sure we keep the peace with them. Wait, is there a solution to this? No. Turns out we're actually starting to get to the phase in U.S. history where I can't tell you what happens. I can just set up problems and hope that we find a solution, but as of this recording, we never really solved this issue between India and Pakistan. They're both still pretty pissed off at each other. Another country that obtains nuclear weapons during this time period is going to be North Korea. Essentially, the North Koreans are going to take a bunch of nuclear weapons and technology and threaten to bomb the United States. We tell them, hey, stop making those nukes and we'll give you food so your people stop starving. And they go, okay. And then, of course, once they're no longer starving, they start building those weapons all over again. This is going to be a constant fight that we have, and we're still dealing with to this time period. We're still dealing with this idea that other countries have these big, powerful weapons, and we have to make sure they don't use them. The thing is, though, Americans start to become really apathetic during the 1990s. Apathy, of course, means that we just aren't really concerned about people throughout the rest of the world. I don't want you guys to confuse this with isolationism. Isolationism means we want to focus on ourselves. Apathy means we just don't really care what's happening around the rest of the world. We kind of go through this big time period of, well, the Soviet Union's been beat, and we spent a lot of money doing it, and we solved that problem, so what are we so worried about? Let's just not fight these fights anymore. It's not worth it. Let's just relax and focus on ourselves and our new toys and play on the internet and look at cat videos all day. And heck, by this time period, the UN's going to become even stronger. Maybe the world doesn't need the United States to be the policeman anymore. I think you guys know what happens later on that kind of goes against all that. Clinton's up for re-election in 1996. It's a very close election, but Clinton is going to win again, mainly because Ross Perot spoils the party. Ross Perot is going to split the Republican ticket again, and Clinton's going to win, despite not getting 50% of the popular vote, he's going to win again. Oh, Ross Perot, when are you going to learn? Now, the second term for Clinton is not going to go as well as the first, mainly because there's going to be some scandals. All right, let's tell the story. Excuse me. So there's two political scandals that happened during Clinton's presidency. The first is the Whitewater scandal. Long story short, Clinton was involved with some sort of land speculation while he was governor of Arkansas. Supposedly, he used the money from the sale of property to fund his race for governor in Arkansas. That's illegal. That's the Whitewater campaign. I can't imagine them ever asking you a question about that, but now you know. The bigger scandal, of course, is going to be involving Monica Lewinsky. In case you're curious, she's there in the upper right. So here's the story. And again, if your parents are listening to this, they might have a different take on this story. They might know some different information, blah, blah, blah. This is the story that your textbook tells you, so I'll tell you that story and maybe add in some more juicy details. Again, this is one of those things that it's better if you are in class when we discuss this, because I'll show you the videos of what Clinton says to America. The story goes like this. Clinton is going to be under investigation for some sexual harassment claims, mainly that stems from a lawsuit brought up by a woman named Paula Jones. During the investigation, it came out that Clinton had an indecent relationship with a young intern at the White House named Monica Lewinsky. At the time, both Clinton and Lewinsky are going to deny any involvement, and Clinton's going to settle his discrimination lawsuit with Paula Jones out of court. However, the media catches wind of this Monica Lewinsky story and is going to blow it up out of proportion. While Clinton is being investigated for Whitewater, more material came up involving Lewinsky, which proved that there was some sort of indecent action taking place between the two in the White House. Clinton is going to be impeached for perjury during the Jones trial. He basically denies under oath that he has any relationship or even any knowledge of who Monica Lewinsky is. You can't lie under oath. That's perjury. He's going to be impeached. Now, when you are impeached, it basically means that it doesn't mean you're going to be removed. It just means that the government, and specifically Congress, is going to have a trial to see if you have broken the law. If you've broken the law, they could push to remove you from being president. Long story short, this big, long media scandal breaks out, and the American public is like, is this really that big of a deal? Are we really going to, blow up the entire U.S. government over this? It's not, yeah, maybe Clinton lied, maybe he has some loose morals, but is it really worth destroying the entire U.S. government over it? The American public says no, and essentially Congress kind of backs down, and the conservative media basically backs down at this time period and just lets the whole thing kind of pass away. What's interesting is that President Clinton's approval rating actually goes up after this scandal. While people were not happy with his supposed affair, this is not going to be seen like a high crime like the Watergate scandal. The American public essentially wanted the conservatives to drop this scandal and stop talking about it, and they do. That was really all I had to say about Clinton in 1996. Let's fast forward to the election of 2000. It is now 2000. William Jefferson Clinton is no longer president, and we need to pick a new one. The election is going to be between two candidates, Al Gore and this dude named George W. Bush. Don't worry about John McCain. He's not important to our story anymore, so just forget he's not on this slide. George W. Bush is the son of the president we talked about previously. He's the son of Herbert Walker Bush. So that just makes this even more confusing. Why must they have the exact same name? We would never have presidents with the same name, would we? Oh, right, John Adams and John Adams. Well, so let's tell the story of this election. On the one hand, you have you have George W. Bush, who's just the candidate at this time period. Bush is going to be like an average American. He is a Southerner. He's from Texas. He is the kind of guy you can just sit back and relax and have a beer with. Although don't, because he doesn't drink alcohol anymore. Um, on the other hand, Al Gore is going to be a super educated liberal. He was the vice president under Bill Clinton. Now, you'd assume the vice president under a successful presidency is pretty much guaranteed the job. But um, Al Gore has one problem. He's really, really smart, but he's not really likable as a person. He's the kind of person that would have a debate with you. He'd say all the right things, but he'd make you kind of feel dumb in the process. And he'd be like, "Why don't you understand what I'm saying?" So in debates, he wouldn't look very good because he'd kind of almost be kind of condescending to the average American. When this election breaks down, if you can see here in the bottom right, go ahead and go full screen here. If you look in the bottom right, you will notice that if you count up the total votes, Gore won. Gore won by 500,000 votes. However, there's going to be a problem with this thing called the Electoral College. So, the Electoral College basically votes for you. You cast a ballot. In California, 55 electors basically decide what your vote actually meant. In the state of Florida, they couldn't make up their mind over whether or not Bush or Gore had won more votes. It's a long, very complicated story, and there are a lot of conspiracy theories behind it. But essentially, Florida is there's going to be a lawsuit, and it goes into the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, you know what? George W. Bush won this election, and they gave the election to George W. Bush. Now, who had more popular votes? Gore. Who was the governor of Florida? Oh, it's George Bush's brother. Who is on the Supreme Court? Oh, a bunch of conservatives that were nominated by Reagan. So again, conspiracy theories abound, but the long story short is that George W. Bush is given the presidency at this time period. He becomes our president. Al Gore disappears and makes a very popular movie about global warming, and George W. Bush is our president. So when he enters the presidency, he's already kind of seen as not really well liked. Things are a little controversial behind how he gets this job. But some very big, crazy events are going to happen during his presidency, and he's going to go from being not really well liked when he starts the job to being one of the most popular presidents of all time. It's one of the most interesting stories in U.S. history, and it's one you've all lived through. Let me tell you how it happened. Oh my goodness. It's the last chapter. Oh, I'm so excited. So excited to be done. I'm also excited to talk about a really interesting presidency, because when this presidency went down, I was your age. I was a junior in high school when President Bush was nominated and elected, and I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened. I remember all of these events vividly, and I'll tell you guys some personal stories. Again, this will be another chapter that I have a lot of videos for, so hopefully you guys will get more in class, and this will just kind of serve as a refresher. Let's talk about the very controversial presidency of George W. Bush. So, let's start by discussing the administration. Before becoming president, George W. Bush was involved in the Texas oil industry, was the owner of the Texas Rangers, a baseball team, and became the governor of Texas in 1994. The first thing he does is he appointed Colin Powell, he's there in the upper right, as Secretary of State, which is the highest held position by a black male in the country up until this time period. And he's also going to name Condoleezza Rice, a black female, as his national security advisor. Now, the first couple months of Bush's presidency are essentially inconsequential. He's going to be supporting big business, but that's what conservatives do, no real shock there. And he starts to really kind of, I don't want to say flounder into the presidency, but things aren't going great for him at the very beginning. A lot of people think he stole this election, and things are just going moderately okay. And then a very tragic event happens. On September 11, 2001, the United States is going to be attacked. 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked by terrorists, and they were used to cause destruction in the United States. Two planes are going to hit the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. One plane hits the Pentagon, and one more was headed for the White House, but it was taken down in a field in Pennsylvania by passengers who overtake the terrorists. The attacks specifically targeted symbols of American economic and military might, and it was specifically done to, well, terrorize the United States. The attacks left around 3,000 Americans dead, and it completely halted the entire United States for several days. It cost the city of New York alone $80 billion. This is the first large-scale terrorist attack on the United States by non-Americans, and the American public is so shocked and horrified that this happened. Having lived through it, I mean, the best way I can describe this to you is like, I'm not even sure the best way to compare it. Thankfully, you guys haven't really been alive for any other really horribly tragic event, and knock on wood, I certainly hope there isn't another one that you guys can compare this to that you lived through. Essentially, imagine like all the political divisions just going away in America, and everyone instead was, well, united. Political divisions are going to fade, and everyone rallies behind the president. Even though the government warned us against such actions, many Americans came to despise Muslims, most of whom had nothing to do with Islamic fundamentalism, that mentality, and that had led to the bombings. In fact, when I was in high school, I'll never forget that a group of Muslim students got jumped 3 days in a row, and they ended up calling in a local imam to come in and speak to the school and say this is what Islam is all about, and to explain that Islamic fundamentalism that would do terrorist acts are not representative of Islam, much in the way that members of the KKK are not representatives of Christianity. So that was a very serious discussion that we had. Again, I'll go into more detail in class. I really hope you were here that day, because it's actually one of my favorite lectures to give. This is President Bush being told that America had been attacked. I believe he was reading to a kindergarten class in Florida at this time period. Here's what the World Trade Center looked like as of 3 years ago. I need to update this slide because the World Trade Center Plaza is now completed. We've built another one. How's America going to respond? On September 12th, Bush is going to declare the bombings an act of war. On September 14th, the Senate unanimously approves giving President Bush full authority to prevent future acts of terrorism. Think of this like a connection to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. On September 20th, Bush is going to address the joint session of Congress and is going to blame Al-Qaeda, led by a man named Osama bin Laden, for the attacks. Bush promised to find and attack Al-Qaeda and their supporters. One area that was supporting them was a Islamic fundamentalist regime called the Taliban in Afghanistan. On October 7th, NATO is going to attack Afghanistan. By mid-December, the United States and NATO had invaded the country of Afghanistan, had conquered Kabul, which of course is the capital, and the Taliban had disbanded. The U.S. declared a victory in the region, but the fighting never stopped in Afghanistan and is actually still going on to this day. The United States is also going to open our military detention center in Guantanamo Bay, which is a military base in Cuba, which is going to house suspected terrorists. Over 900 people are going to be held in this detention center for over 13 years, many never given the right of habeas corpus. 9/11 is going to make the country more security conscious. Airports can now only be staffed by American citizens, and the country was put on a color-coded terror alert level system, which never changed from being highly elevated. Congress is also going to pass something called the USA Patriot Act, which was designed to find terrorists living in the United States. Think of this as like the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are designed to have people stop talking bad on the government. The USA Patriot Act is the exact same idea. It defined, or take that back, it said the government could basically look into you if you were a domestic terrorist. The problem was, domestic terrorist is so liberally defined, and by liberal I mean widely defined, that you are a domestic terrorist right now. Did you take this picture? No. So, or, well, for example, me, I didn't take this picture, but I've included it and not sourced it in my PowerPoint. That means I must have stolen it. I'm breaking a law. If you've ever sped in your car, if you've ever not worn a seatbelt, if you've ever driven someone in your car that wasn't your family before the age of 18, you have all broken some sort of a law. You, by definition, are a domestic terrorist, and the U.S. government can suspend the Bill of Rights to research into you to make sure that you're not doing other terrorist activity. Seem kind of scary? I know. It's also true. The government also creates the Department of Homeland Security, whose sole purpose is to prevent any future terrorist attacks on the United States. We're also going to attack back against those who attacked us. In January of 2002, President Bush is going to declare that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were part of an axis of evil that needed to be dealt with. Now, what's interesting is by this point, the war in Afghanistan is still not over, and Osama bin Laden is nowhere to be found. We have no idea where he is. President Bush is going to accuse Saddam Hussein of being involved in 9/11 and for harboring weapons of mass destruction, which he had been hiding from the United Nations. The U.S. had little to no proof of this claim and never came forward with concrete details to back up what we said. The push for a war in Iraq was led by a new group of conservatives known as neoconservatives. They demanded an aggressive foreign policy in the Middle East in order to protect American freedom. The war officially breaks out on March 19, 2003. Congress never officially declares war, but they had given the president the authority to protect American interests in Iraq. By early April of 2003, U.S. troops had conquered Baghdad again, and on May 1st, Bush declared that the mission in Iraq was accomplished. He even stood and took a picture about it. There it is. But wait a minute. Did this war end in March of 2003? Or by April of 2003? No. In fact, this war is kind of still going on today. So was this mission really accomplished? No. Was our mission accomplished? No. In point of fact, we never found weapons of mass destruction. We don't find Osama bin Laden. We don't really have any connection to Al-Qaeda. This was a giant, giant mess. By 2005, Iraq had gotten even worse. The resistance movement in Iraq had not slowed down, the U.S. death toll has risen above 2,000, and suddenly Iraq is essentially becoming another Vietnam. It's this long, never-ending war against an enemy we can't seem to defeat, even though we have superior military technology and ability over them. In fact, the U.S. could not win the hearts and minds of all the Iraqi people. The United States comes promoting democracy to overthrow an evil tyrant, but all they did was destroy property and really do nothing to endear ourselves to the Iraqi people. This war is also going to be plagued by fraud. Defense contracts are given to a company called Halliburton. Remember the military-industrial complex? A company once owned by Dick Cheney, the vice president. Oil exports are going to remain low. There is evidence of prisoner of war mistreatment by U.S. soldiers, and even bringing democracy to the country was becoming a challenge. This entire war had gotten really, really bad. Saddam Hussein is going to be captured in December of 2003, but even that does not lead to a decrease in the opposition in his country. If anything, it makes the Iraqis even more upset. Soon, Americans are going to lose hope for victory in Iraq. American morale was low, and the war was seen as pointless, especially when the bombings continued and no WMDs were ever found. There was also no connection found between Saddam Hussein and bin Laden. The American people felt lied to and betrayed. As a result of declining American support, Bush begins a process of turning the war over to the Iraqi people, just like Vietnamization. However, the U.S. is still occupying the region and is actively fighting there to this day. In 2011, the Iraq conflict was declared over, but troops have still never really fully left the region. As of 2003, this war on terror has cost the United States over $1.7 trillion with a T dollars. Over 6,000 soldiers are dead, with an over 50,000 more wounded. And because of this war, there is an inherent distrust of Republican leadership, leading to the Democrat victory in 2008. Let's talk about some other stuff that happens during Bush's presidency. On top of the war, Bush is going to face another serious issues while president. The US is going to be facing a rising trade deficit. This means that essentially we are spending more money and buying more stuff from other countries than we're making here in the United States. The main reason for this is China. You guys may have noticed that everything you own was probably made in China. This happens because their workers work for a lot cheaper than American workers, so we have them make products for us. It means your iPhone is cheaper, but it also means that the US economy is being ruined because there are fewer jobs available in the United States. Bush is going to promote this idea of what we call outsourcing jobs overseas. It saves Americans money in the short term, but it actually hurts our economy in the long term. President Bush also has a semi-negative record when it comes to the idea of the environment. The term global warming became mainstream in the 1990s, but the problems with global climate change did not really surface until the middle of Bush's presidency. Man-made environmental disasters are not helping this time period either. The US is the main offender when it comes to this climate crisis. We use over 25% of the world's energy and make over 25% of the world's pollution. So we need to do something to get rid of this, right? Unfortunately, President Bush is not overly concerned about the environment, and he's going to remove or veto any legislation designed to improve the environment or reduce carbon emissions. It got so bad that in 2004, the United Nations comes in and calls for a global meeting on climate problems, known as the Kyoto Protocol. It called for a global effort to reduce carbon emissions worldwide. President Bush refused to sign this agreement. On top of that, the prosperity of the 90s does not last long. Many of the overnight millionaires are going to end up losing their jobs on Wall Street and Silicon Valley. While not a problem in its own right, that is going to spread to other sectors of the economy. Industrial production is going to halt in this country because the rich aren't buying anything anymore, and soon the unemployment rate is going to skyrocket. Scandals break out as people soon discover all the shady business practices that were happening during the 1990s, part of what made it so prosperous. Large companies like Enron, ask your parents, are going to collapse, leaving hundreds of thousands of Americans out of work. The makeup of the American workforce is going to change as well. Over 62% of American workers work white-collar jobs. These are jobs that are typically associated with management rather than actually making something. A white-collar job market is better for the young, as they are typically better educated in a changing world. As such, it becomes even more difficult during this time period for people that are over the age of 45 to get a job. Another element of President Bush's presidency is this idea of no child left behind. President Bush's wife, Laura, was a former school librarian, and she was very interested in fixing the failing public education system. The large-scale educational reform brought about by President Bush was known as No Child Left Behind. The idea was, let's standardize the curriculum and give standardized tests to students every year to make sure that every student is getting the same curriculum nationwide. This would help ensure that every student, regardless of income, geographic area, gender, race, or anything else, was getting the same education. Schools are going to be ranked on test scores, and schools with low scores could be taken over by the government until they improved. With so much at stake, obviously schools are going to start focusing on passing these tests rather than fully teaching content. And soon, extracurricular activities are going to be cut with the expense of spending more time on core classes. Quick break here while I clear my throat. Look at how much being president ages people. This is President Bush at the start of his presidency and the end. President Clinton at the start and the end. And this is Obama in 2008 versus 2012. Being president must be a tough job. So why on earth would you run for re-election? I guess if you're already doing it, you might as well keep going. The cost of running for president had soared considerably. Consider this. In the 2000 election, over $400 million was spent on the campaign. It was estimated that in 2008, Obama spent over $1 billion on his campaign. People began to demand reform, saying that there was too much money in politics. In 2002, Bush initiated a program known as Campaign Finance Reform. The idea was to make it so that businesses, unions, and individuals can only contribute so much money to a campaign. Unfortunately, through legal loopholes, it basically made it that businesses could continue to donate more and more money, whereas individuals were going to be limited. There's still a lot of money in politics, kids. Sorry. The Democrats are going to pick in this election a candidate named John Kerry. He's a senator from Massachusetts who's a decorated Vietnam War vet, and Kerry's going to appeal to the American public. Unfortunately, Kerry spent a little bit too much time in the Senate, and he was very hard to actually nail down on an opinion. You would ask him, XYZ, right? And he would say, well, X, but also sometimes A, Y, but also B, and let's not forget about Z and C. Like, he would never just flat out say yes or no on something. He would argue both sides. The American public didn't know what he truly believed. He's going to lose this election. President Bush remains our president. Remember the baby boom? You know, all those babies that were born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s? Well, guess what? They want to retire. And we've set up a program for retirement. This idea of Social Security, that we basically just pay people to keep existing, well, that's all fine and good, but what happens when there are more retired people than there are people to basically supplement their income through taxes? This starts to become a problem in the after the year 2000. And one of the ideas is, hey, what if we take all of that money that we put in Social Security and invest that in the stock market? We can privatize Social Security, put the money in the stock market, and so long as the stock market goes up, we'll make more and more money for Social Security. It'll pay for itself. It's a brilliant idea, unless the stock market ever goes down, which, of course, as we know, is not possible, and that would never happen. Fortunately, we don't put all of our money, all of our Social Security money, in the stock market, because the stock market does have a horrible collapse in the year 2008. Go ahead, ask your parents. I'm sure they could tell you all about it. Anyway, point here is that we don't privatize Social Security, but it does become a major concern. Is there a solution? Not as of this recording. Another big black eye on the legacy of President Bush is going to be a environmental disaster that happens in 2005. In August of 2005, a series of hurricanes is going to hit the Gulf Coast, and there's so much water being in the Mississippi River that it's already oversaturated, and it would be a really, really bad thing if one more hurricane hits. Unfortunately, that one more hurricane does come. It's called Hurricane Katrina, and essentially, if it adds so much water into the Mississippi River Mississippi River Valley system that it's going to cause the river to overflow its banks and flood specifically the city of New Orleans. Hundreds of people are going to die, and millions more are going to lose their homes, and the damage to the city was in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The hardest hit areas were in inner city low-income black neighborhoods. The question was, who's in charge of fixing this problem? In fact, this is actually a really good way to end this course. We've been discussing the entire year, we talk about the growth of federal power. It starts out that we want a weak central government, and then we write the Constitution to give the government more power. Then the government spends the next 50 years through the Marshall Court decisions getting more and more power, right? So obviously the federal government's the most powerful and they should step in, right? Well, the thing is, it doesn't say in the Constitution that if there's an environmental disaster, it's up to the U.S. government to solve the problem. That's a state problem. So, there's a big fight between the governor of Louisiana, the mayor of New Orleans, and President Bush over who's in charge. President Bush doesn't do the right thing and just step up and say, American lives are at stake, I'm in charge, I'm the president for Pete's sake, and instead kind of lets this problem kind of fester. Meanwhile, Americans are dying. Many people are going to criticize President Bush and say, you know what? The only reason why he let this happen was because it was poor, underprivileged neighborhoods that were suffering and not rich, wealthy neighborhoods that are suffering. By the time the federal government gets involved, it takes weeks, and in some cases months, to get anything fixed. A later investigation found out that the government was involved in over $900 million in fraud in Hurricane Katrina. To this day, New Orleans is still damaged in certain areas and trying to recover from this event. So what's President Bush's legacy? He's a very polarizing president. After the 9/11 attacks, he has the highest approval rating of any president ever, and when he leaves the presidency in 2008, he has the lowest approval rating of any president ever. In fact, by the year 2006, the American public is essentially fed up with President Bush, and he spends the last 2 years of his presidency as a lame duck president. He isn't someone that the people generally listen to. The government doesn't really take him seriously, and he's essentially going to be mocked and ridiculed throughout public media. In fact, after he left the presidency, he basically spends the rest of his time in relative obscurity. In fact, you probably don't know what he's up to right now. Why? He just decided to leave public life. It's kind of a sad story for him. One last thing, and then we are officially done with APUS, because I decided to stop this class in 2008. If you look at the election of 2008, you will notice that a new candidate, a Democrat, is going to win this election. And if you ask me, based on the failures of President Bush, it was pretty much guaranteed that a Democrat was going to win the presidency, mainly because that war in Iraq had gone so terribly for the Republican Party. President Obama is going to win this election pretty easily. If you notice, he has 365 electoral votes to John McCain's 173, and Barack Obama becomes the first black president of the United States. And that is where I will end this course. We knocked out 3 chapters in just over an hour and a half. Good work, guys. Good luck in your studying. Let's kick some butt on this AP exam. I know you can do it. See you in class.